Well, thank you for being here. And 50 years goes by in a blink when you think about it. And in putting this presentation together, I realized I'd done hundreds of presentations before, various events throughout the years, be it related to BIM or RAIC. And this has been the hardest one to put together. In so many ways, because do you make it about yourself? Do you not make it about yourself? What do you touch on? And so what I thought was really there's a continuity here at all times. And as much as it's my journey, it's your journey as well, and everybody else that has been part of that journey along the way, and a bit of a legacy as well in terms of looking back over the 50 years. And then realizing that it isn't just about the architecture, but it's about many other things. And I think one of the most profound is the relationship we have with our clients. And so I was thinking back to some of my first clients, some of the recent ones, some of the ones such as, unfortunately, Scott and I have had to encounter. And, you realize that it is evolving, and because the nature of our work evolves as well. So when I looked at this, putting this together and thinking about being part of this great profession for 50 years, all great art is steeped in the past. But actually, architecture participates in a constant negotiation with the past, the present, and the future. And it's always in a state of flux. So what I'm going to try to do today is connect in some way the pieces of the puzzle that take us to the past, the present, and the future, and that how external things impact what we do, but also the people do along the way. So in many ways, we're all products of parents, and we're passed on through our DNA certain qualities and traits. And I've always strongly believed that we pass on a form of DNA as architects and those involved in the profession to one another. And we can touch generation after generation. And in some way, thinking back, again, this engagement of past, present, and future, thinking back, how did the past architects that connected and technologists influence what we've done? And I ask myself that question. What influences has there been by virtue of passing on as we're doing today? So really this legacy is your legacy. It's not mine. It's really your legacy is next. And so when we look at it, let's go back to 1972. And at that time, Stevenson Ferguson was the firm I went to work with, and it came about rather quirkily because my parents had moved to Scotland when I was 11, and because of the structure of the education system, you had to be 18 by September the 1st to go to a Scottish university. I was going to be 18 in December. So what was I going to do? Go back to high school for another year? No, I was done with high school. And so I asked the rector, was there an architect's office at the school? And he put me in touch with John Ballan Stevenson, who is perennially and into perpetuity one of my greatest mentors that I've had the privilege to work with. The other thing that Mr. Stevenson, which was funny because I called him old Mr. Stevenson. When I met him, he was younger than me. So a kind of very strange situation. But one of the things that John Ballan Stevenson was the last of the apprenticed architects. After his generation, architectural education came about, and it was through university degrees. He was in partnership with David Ferguson. There was also another partner who, because he fought in the Second World War, got his degree with, I think, with Kellogg Packet Tops, and nobody had much respect for him. But nonetheless, learned a lot. So this was our studio space in here, 17 Barn Street in there. I was upstairs where those two windows are, and the other partner, one of the things he did was, he's a very strange character. We nicknamed him Bambi. His name was Alistair Murdoch Buchanan. One of the things he did was he put these screens in the windows so he couldn't look out. So I was up in what was a 2-bedroom space. George, who was a wonderful technologist, got that window, and Mr. Stevenson was down the bottom. So this is where it kind of all started for me. And thinking back, what was day one like? Well, the morning was me sitting down with George and let me see how good you are at printing. So fortunately, I'd taken a technical drafting course at high school. And he gave me a sheet of paper, and for an hour, I had to write the alphabet out and the numbers, for an hour, in and out. And he gave me kind of an indicator, which is very much this style. But one of the things was, I was intrigued by the technology. At that time, there was a parallel square, but what I got was one of those with a prop and a stool. And the stool had a hand hole in it so that you could lift it up and you could walk it to a certain spot and put it down. So then in the afternoon, I'd been printing and drafting, showed me how to turn a pencil as you drafted in pencil, how the ink pens worked, all of those things, high tech at that point in time. And then in the afternoon, I was given my first job. This house was converted previously into apartments. So you take the drawings from that one and you make it match that one. It was a trace job, and very quickly realized all I had to do was flip the drawings over and I could probably save myself a pile of time. So that was my first day, was working with this technology. And again, these strange, quirky connections all the way down through time. The competitor firm was a firm called Cowie Architects. They were 100 meters away from us. That's 17 Barn Street down there. They had a fancy office that overlooked Wellington Square, which is where the county building was in Ayr. And who was in there? Craig Henderson at the same time.
Wow.
We never met until years later when we came to Edmonton and started asking questions of one another. But Craig was there all that time, and we never met. We had a common friend who moved in 2 different circles. Sanny Henry was his name. And it was ultimately, we all got back together. But Craig, it was quite surprising to find out he worked for the competitor firm. So my days were filled with actually having a lot of fun, doing renderings of facade upgrades on some old houses. Eaglesham was where one of the first ones I worked on, and got a love of old architecture. And one of the things that they didn't encourage, nor did they discourage, was the notion of private jobs, PJs. And so I was fortunate to fairly quickly on get a private job, which is still, I went to Google Earth and it's still there today. It was for this couple. They owned the bar further down the street from here to put in 2 dormer bedrooms for their family, their young children that they had. So I got to do that dormer up there. And then to learn from Mr. Stevenson, he often would tell me, you're going to go to university and learn a lot about design and theory and structure. I'm not going to teach you any of that. I'm going to talk to you about the business of architecture and being what he termed, become an architect's architect, the one that could look up to. So one of the projects I had was this little barn. This is, believe it or not, this is the now abandoned University of Glasgow Department of Agriculture. They built a whole new building. But way back then, it was a new building when I managed to work on it. And so Stevenson Ferguson had this job. This is, you can see out across the hills to Turnberry. This is the south end of the Isle of Arran. So Ayr is way in the distance, about 20, 30 minutes. And so I got this little job to do, this hut almost, which was a crop husbandry building. And so I was quite thrilled, worked on it. One of the things with Stevenson Ferguson, he always said if I wanted to come back and work while I was at university, happy to do so. He says, even if you wanted a day's worth of work, he would find a day's worth of work for me. And so I was working on this, and I came back at a November break and said, we're going for a drive. And I said, oh, great. So we got in the car, he brought me out to the site, and on that building, he had the contract, and he says, okay, show Allan. He took the windows, and they fell through. And yeah, all those windows that were down there fell through. And he said, there's a solution, but you're going to figure it out. And he took off and said, call me at the office when you figured it out. Contractor's here, can ask him questions. And there was a phone box which was down where roughly those houses were. So I fretted the whole time, asking this contractor, could we do this? No, that's going to cost money. So eventually figured it out. So I called him up and he said, okay, what's your solution? I said, well, I talked to the contractor and he said that we haven't done the openings in the extension yet, but the windows are here. So the windows that were the right size were on that extension, and the windows to the wrong size that I did were here. All they had to do was frame them 3 inches shorter. No big deal. So he said, yeah. So he came back and he picked me up and he said, so what did you learn today, Allan? I said, well, you know, that I can work with a contractor? No. That we can solve it? No. He said, I asked you a question very early on, and the question was, did you review the shop drawings? And you said yes. So he said, it was the fact you said yes. You owned the mistake. And he taught me a valuable lesson. He says, 9 out of 10 mistakes you can solve never happen. And the 1 out of 10 is solvable 9 out of 10 times. So never worry. So he taught me a valuable lesson. Own your mistakes. So sadly, when I went online only to find out that this thing is now abandoned and the land's for sale, these were nice looking buildings once upon a time, but you know what, 50 years on, I know how they feel. Then I went on to kind of work on first commercial project, which was kind of interesting. This is a one that was in the hometown I was in, and still remarkable that it's still around to this day. And I can still remember doing some of the detailing on this. But let's talk about the history. So the blue are all the apprenticed Scottish architects in the family tree. So Peter Sinclair was an architect in Ayr. And the Sybils, this was the basic structure of apprenticeship. So there was usually a senior architect would then be assigned like a mentor. And Robert Sibbald was the first of the powerhouse of Dundee. And this is another firm that came along, Blackadder and Allen. What's interesting about this firm was Robert Blackadder actually demerged himself from the partnership when he got wind of a big project, and he figured if I demerge myself, I could take this project and do it myself. Nice guy. So he took off. So this powerhouse of Robertson, David Allen's firm at that time, and Robert Sybald's firm was the powerhouse of firms in Dundee that did an incredible amount of work. And it so happened that I happened to go to Dundee School of Architecture, interestingly around this time. And there was somebody in our class, and first year, he never showed up in any studios. He repeatedly would disappear. He would come in on crit day and he'd bring his work in. His reports were absolutely stunning. His designs were unbelievable. The models were just unbelievable, well detailed. And I couldn't even put models together like that. So when I talked to one of my colleagues a number of years ago, I said, hey, what happened to this guy? He said he got found out that somebody was actually doing his work for him, and he got struck off the register. Interestingly, he was the great-grandson of that person. And so it was that firm that actually then, in turn, helped him out. Never did one project in the studio. Anyway, let's press on. So you can begin to see how he kind of builds it out. Predominantly firms in Scotland were all sole proprietor. Very rarely would there actually be a partnership. But a powerful one was the one with William Byrne and Andrew Heighton that did so much work in Glasgow in particular. And then the family tree on that side ends up, James Graham is the last one of the apprenticeship. He was actually self-taught. So this was the point at which you kind of go into the realm of gentleman architects and people working in the field. So then continued to connect it on. And so we get to William Byrne worked for Sir Robert Smirke. Sir Robert Smirke is the one credited with developing a bill of quantities. And he used it on the British Museum. That's the first, they believe, recorded instance of where a bill of quantities was put together by an architect. You begin to see the connections now? So he set the pattern. The other thing he did was he designed Canada House in Trafalgar Square. So a well-known architect, also the one who did the British Museum. And then we come to Sir John Soane, who I've admired for many, many years. And you actually get to the brothers that, well, one of the son and the father, George Dance the younger, and then you finally get to George Dance the elder, and that's it. That's the self-trained. So we can trace our lineage all the way back to Sir John Soane and beyond. Now, 1695 is an interesting year in all of this, because this group actually suffered from a taxation on windows. And we think of how government brings about stupid taxes. This was the one that was brought about as a government tax on windows. It was great because the tax collector didn't have to go into the building. He could just stay outside and watch it. But what it did was it set for 155 years architects having to do 6 windows or less where they couldn't afford the house. That was the rule. If you had 7 or more windows, you were taxed. So what did that do? Well, then that's why if you travel around the UK, you can often see the remnants of this 155-year-old tax law. And we think of tax laws now and how they influence us. But those 4 architects, for their entire career, all they ever knew was a window tax and a restriction on windows. It was repealed 155 years later. There was actually a doctor who said that without sufficient light, ventilation, there were epidemics of typhus, smallpox, and cholera. So anybody see the connection with lockdowns? Take away the daylight. The other thing they did as well was even a lot of larders or pantries were ventilated. There was a little ventilation grill. They taxed you on that ventilation grill too. That was counted as a window. So can you imagine if people blocked up their larders, what would happen to the food? It would go off very, very quickly. So the tax was eventually repealed, but it shows that they never knew any difference. So when we face these influences as architects, technologists involved in this profession, these can have an impact. So 1695, when George Dance was born, he didn't know anything but a window tax his entire life. And it was all the way up to Sir Robert Smirke. So now we're going to go the other way. In 1975, I came to Canada, and I absolutely fell in love with the country and the woman. And this was my first project, which is Duck Cove Inn up on Cabot Trail. It was a wonderful project. I really enjoyed it. And I've loved the fact that the owners have stayed the same. It's been in the family, and they're true to the colors. The colors were the same colors that selected. And that was a lot of fun. And then we had a fire. The architect worked with took off back to the UK. And so I decided to go learn another form of daylight robbery and work with a contractor, and got to see it from the other end. I made that construction firm a lot of money off that school, just by virtue of finding things in the drawings that were incorrect. So, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. So then we come to Edmonton and worked with Ron Lines, and this is sort of the time when it began to just getting caught up on all things being postmodern and that point in time. And working with Barry Johns, we won Canadian Architect Award with Pinoca. And so the reference in Pinoca to grain elevators, again, the connection down through time with us involved in grain elevators. And it was a time for doing lots of things with pencil crayon, and also Operation Friendship, which was a delightful project. And then they had a long name because they kept adding names every time a principal was made. So it was actually Wynne, Forbes, Lord, Feldberg, Schmidt, and Croll Architects. And there was a continuity with Gordie Wynne at that point in time, who I managed to work with on a small project early on that he was doing at the end of his career, which was the new Glenrose Hospital, which is now the old Glenrose Hospital. So there's a continuity here, and I think one of the things I enjoyed at this time was there was a small project which was taking the rehearsal hall at the Jubilee Auditorium and refurbishing it. And we set it up so that these panels could, acoustic panels could fold into the wall. They could get high reflection for certain types of music, and then as close as possible to the full auditorium would be when the panels were opened out. I was working on this project for about a year, and I was with George Lord on it. And about 6 months before, kept saying, we need to talk about the schedule and go through it. And he said, yeah, Allan, we'll do that. We'll have a look at that. It comes down to 2 months, and need to talk about the schedule. He says, yeah, we'll do that. And then he said, yeah, and I'm going away to Taiwan in a month and a half for about 2 months. So I was just sweating bullets. Comes down to 2 weeks before, we've really got to get together. Yeah, we'll do that. So on a Friday, he's just walking out. That was him. He was gone. And I said, I need to talk to you. He says, Allan, for God's sake, just do it right. And so, okay, let's do it right. But in many ways, the lesson of that is that sometimes we need to just think for ourselves. Nobody ever gets criticized for doing something. And it goes back to an earlier day when George, who taught me how to draft in Stevenson Ferguson, Mr. Stevenson was he used to ask questions, and I hoped that they were rhetorical questions, and they never were. Had answered, and he said, George had been with the firm for 30 years. And in 30 years, George had never made one mistake. And he said, why he didn't make a mistake? Hoping it was a rhetorical question. I said, no, I don't. He says, well, that's because George never made a damn decision. Don't be a George. So, don't be a George. And then I think one of the highlights of this period of time was working on the Edmonton Journal building. And I worked a lot with Craig on this. And at that point in time, Craig was a junior partner in the firm, so he wasn't an equity partner. And Sig Schmidt was the principal. And I'd worked and done this scheme where we had a wonderful glass atrium in the front, kind of broke up the facade a bit more. And then Sig wanted us to do the drum on the corner. So sometimes you don't get your way. But there are things that are delightful about the building. What is unknown is there is a central stair that goes all the way up with breakout areas on it as you go up. It's a wonderful space, wonderful feeling as you go up, and that was to connect all the newsrooms. It was very different. So it was a very engaging project, and one enjoyed a lot. From there, I decided to go out on my own. There's sort of a love-hate relationship with that period of time with myself, but I really wanted to know if I could do it on my own. And so the work of wrap architecture at that time was probably divided, interestingly, into a lot of emerging heritage work, but actually a lot of work in Jasper. We did what was then the Unitel building down at the train station. We did the Villa Caruso on the corner with, at that point in time, I just met a new structural engineer. The client was Greek, so it was really nice to have Dino on your team. And doing that in addition to Baxter's gift is one that's a lot of fun. It was also the time when really started to come to terms with technology. And this was how you ruined your eyes back a number of years ago. It was photogrammetry. And from using points on a facade, you could actually build a complete model of the building. And so we did that in AutoCAD. So it was a lot of heritage work that we came out of that period of time. It was also a time for experimenting, I think, with structure. I was starting to feel comfortable that I could push the envelope a little bit, and Kiewit wanted to do their own offices. And one of the things that they had a scheme done out of Toronto, and it was just full of columns. And I just said, we got to have a way to get rid of these columns and just clear span. And again, working with Dino on this building, we devised a method that we put all the bracing into a structural system around the outside of the building, and hence the inverted V shapes. And this was a clear span, 60 feet across, so very flexible. At the time I left wrap architecture because Craig was pretty disappointed that I wouldn't stay, but he did make me promise. He said that if I ever changed my mind, I had to come and see him first. I had to talk to him first. So at that time, Stuart Inglis was with Cassian. So Stuart came over, filled the spot that I'd vacated. And so Henderson Inglis was formed. And from that, we created HIP Architects. And at the same time, during that period, formed Next Architecture version 1 in 2008, we sort of went through 2016. And not to show you any of the work, I think you're all familiar with HIP's work, so I wasn't going to bore you with seeing it again. But it was a lot of fun in those years working in there. But it was also challenging times because it was in 2008. I realized that the industry has to change in a dramatic way. So from that, we then get to next architecture. And here we are. So you can see your legacy all the way back to 1695. So probably there's many honourable mentions, but one I always enjoyed was Jim Sterling. I got to know him in first and second year at Dundee. He was a visiting crit for the first 3 years, first year, second year, and third year. And what I liked about Jim was that all he ever was worried about and wondered about was design. And there's this wonderful picture, the little small one in the bottom, which is the firm, Jim Sterling and James Gowan. And Gowan was the commensurate business development, and Jim was the stay-at-home, work with everybody. And he was well known for marking up drawings and really getting into the details. I remember him at a crit. I was doing a ski lodge, and one of the professors who had never practiced architecture was going on and on and on about maintenance of these windows up high and blah, 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 and how do you get to them? And Jim just said, buy a effing long ladder. Point taken. His love of geometry inspired me a lot to explore. And I think this shows up in how Ian and I worked on AUPE to get the geometry right. It was always a product of the geometry. And a love of axonometrics. The one in the center is one I did for the Scottish National Trust. They got this free service out of drafting out of students of a mill that was in Scotland. And then this is Barry Johns' first office, and I just loved the way he drew his axonometrics, and he did them orthographically as well, looking from the bottom up, the worm's eye view, as he used to call them. The other thing was that he never sketched any building on a piece of paper bigger than a letter size. He had a sketch pad, trace pad, which was 8.5 by 11. And that's what he worked all his projects on. He never believed you should try and work at a large scale, that if you could keep it compact. And so, you know, I see this continuity, this continuing love of just sketching, which sadly I don't get enough time to do. But nonetheless, when I do, I'm grateful for it. So, as mentioned, you know, the relationship between us as architects and a client is continuously evolving. And I got to say that I've enjoyed working on every project, despite the client. I've enjoyed every project. And so it's hard to actually say which of those buildings, and that's what I struggled with, which is my favorite building, because they're all my favorites. And I just felt that that was always important. I just think it's a privilege to be part of that, to be able to help in some way, influence. But there is what I wanted to show was I do have a favorite building. I do have a favorite building. Not one that I've designed, but I admired from the first time I saw it at the age of 11. And what I wanted to do is just show you how I copied it in a project. So this is Wemyss Bay. If you go up to Scotland, you go out to the islands, you get on a ferry here at and go over to Rothesay. So one of the first times we were up in Scotland, we decided, my family, my parents and my brother, were going to take a trip over the Isle of Rothesay. So we came up to this building, and I thought, wow, nondescript, sort of faux Tudor, not that I knew it back then. But what struck me as being impressive was once you got through this traditional portico and the building opened up with incredible piece of glazing and engineering, I just was blown away that how they could do this thing and then go through that portal, and it's like you're in another world. I thought I'd gone through a time warp. And 1862, the Wemyss Bay terminal, you can see this wonderful piece of engineering. And here are those buildings that all wrap around the outside, as if to say there's a tenuousness to say, we're not bold enough yet, we're too much in the present, but in the future, this might well have been able to stand alone, but it couldn't right then. A wonderful piece of engineering, coincidental with everything else that was going on. And how do you develop some of those drawings? Well, you have to literally unfold where the circular elements, you have to develop them as flat facades. So the Shaw Auditorium was the one where I thought, I kept coming back to this one over the years. And from Shaw Auditorium is how do you wrap around and how do you make something that has a shell? How do you go from the building up above, which is the Mazankowski building, and how do you actually go down and go into a completely new space? So this was the opportunity I saw to copy it. As many of you know, I have a love of sci-fi, so the chief cardiologist at the time loved the sound of the Star Trek doors as they open. He says, "Can we get that?" So things related to Star Trek, my love of Doctor Who, which engrossed me at a very young age, and Close Encounters of the Third Kind. All of those imageries played very much into that Shaw Auditorium. And so this earlier on, this early Revit, very early Revit, when you struggled with it, it's so many, but we used it to kind of begin to explore developing what this might look like. So, piece of the idea that all the pieces around the outside, somewhat traditional wrap around this inner cell. And then it was an opportunity to say, okay, well, the Wemyss Bay was very much a fabricated element. All the trusses and everything were brought to the site. They were riveted into place and the glass was placed on top. Could we do the same? Could we treat the architecture as a fabrication, not as a construction? It was in many ways forced upon us because Mazankowski was going through its LEED certification and we were just told no drywall. So could we make this like a manufactured piece? And that led us to developing it. So it's got a bit of everything. But what intrigued me is, I think some of you have seen this picture on my screen time and time again. And this is when you go through that portal at Wemyss Bay Station, this is what you see on the other side. And so that's how I copied my favorite building. So let's go back to daylight robbery for a bit, because again, a career is about learning these pieces. And Sohn gave the classic definition of professional responsibility in 1788. Basically, the business of the architect is to make the design and estimates, direct the work. He said all these things which in many ways are embodied in things that we're doing today. And he said this in response to, if those are the duties of an architect, with what propriety can his situation and that of the builder or contractor be united? So he was pointing out that there's problems if we have general construction. So interestingly, the connection to William Byrne, that we talked about, worked with Isambard Kingdom Brunel on some of the architectural aspects. But Sohn warned about design and construction. He pushed for retention of tripartite agreements. At that point in time, there was a close bond between the client, the architect, and the trades. That was the group that worked together. And he tried to resist linear processes that were coming in. A lot of it was parallel. But then you go to a cool dude like Isambard Kingdom Brunel. He absolutely ignored separation of design and construction. No way, not going to happen. Directly engaged and encouraged trade involvement and employed a lot of parallel processes in his work. So we can see the challenge and why in 1788 we deviated and we're taking so long to come back. So what's the proof of the pudding? Well, let's look at these two buildings because I think this speaks to what many things I've learned over the years as to if something is absolutely right, it has absolute proof that it's absolutely correct. And if it doesn't, there's something wrong with it. So two buildings, very early, the Houses of Parliament in the UK. Up until that point, the Palace at Westminster had burned down, and so there was a project that had come out. At the same time, Brunel was working on Paddington Station with a group of investors, the Great Western Railway, which is still around today. You can see the livery on the side. And they basically said, we don't know if this rail thing is going to take off. So we don't want to spend a lot of money on this if it's going to fall flat in our face. So the two comparisons, the Houses of Parliament, public sector, absolutely no temporary facilities to put anybody anywhere. It was overscheduled by about 3 decades. The final cost was never fully disclosed, but it started off at about £700,000, and they said it went to 2.4. They never said it stopped at 2.4. They said it went to 2.4 million. It utilized traditional stone and mortar. Currently, the renovation will cost $35 billion, and they say 75 years to complete. And its current useful life is 0 years. So there's a huge conundrum. Do they just abandon it and build a new one? But 35 billion and the costs continue to go up. But Paddington, private sector. One of the things that Brunel did was an old bridge across the road from Paddington. He said, how about we'll set up a temporary facility and we'll build something just to kind of get things moving along. At the end, it was on schedule, it was on cost. He utilized emergent technologies. What he did was he went to Paxton, who had just done Crystal Palace, and said, hey, do you think you could make an arch to go over this thing called a railway? And so he used all the emergent technologies. The renovation cost, the major one they did, was 55 million and took 4 years. Its current useful life is 75 years. So it is staggering, the comparisons. So what the hell went wrong? Well, see how many of these you can figure out for today. So the controversial design, it went through numerous competitions. Barry was accused of stealing from some of his competitors' ideas. So that was one. Also, there was a favoritism, they said, in the selection of the architect. The cost overruns, as mentioned, £700,000 to start, got to 2.4 million. No evidence where it went, but it's sealed and will apparently never be revealed. So right from day one, here's some of the things, again, just to show how we can't keep doing something that doesn't work. They omitted £44,000 for embankment work. They knew they're on a river, but they didn't have that in the budget, or so the contractor says. £70,000 for land acquisition. Didn't figure out who owned the land. $3,000 for carriageway, and guess what? Nobody priced the big clock in Big Ben. So can you imagine if we, again, past, present, and future becomes an evolving. If we were sitting around doing this today and the contractor says, oh, I don't have the clock in the price. Not at all unusual. Delays. Architect said it would take 7 years. Took over 30. Material issues. supply chain. The stone they selected wasn't available in quantities that they want. They only had enough for that light band that's there. So they went to another stone which started decaying within 2 years. So material issues all the way through. Heating and ventilation issues. Nobody figured out putting all those people inside a location, them all smoking pipes and cigars and everything else, and no ventilation. Feuds, yeah, typical. That goes on and on. Acoustics, you'd think in an auditorium you'd want to get the acoustics right. No, they had to spend thousands of pounds correcting that problem. And sanitary sewer issues, workforce problems. Masons went on strike, wouldn't come back. That took 2 years out the schedule. And bad publicity. It's not all unusual what we face today. So again, these are all things that in my career, in the 50 years, all these things have come to play an important part in how I think through a project and ultimately try to avoid as much as we can for our clients. So let's talk about restoration. It's going to kind of lead to where I've been very interested in this area for a number of years now. If we have controversial design, we should have, if we have cost overruns, why can't we have cost certainty? Delays, why can't we have schedule predictability? Secure supply chain, make something truly sustainable, relational agreements, revolutionize the payment process, distributable ledgers, people with jobs and jobs with people. We're having a problem where we don't have enough in a workforce, and have pride in our process, product, and ultimately in the price. So let's just look at, again, for me, 50 years on, these are the things that continue to resonate the most. We should be the ones making the design and estimates. We should measure and value the different parts. We need to be the intermediate agent between client whose honor and interest we must respect and the trades whose rights we must defend. To be honorable. Develop great trust, be responsible for mistakes, negligence, and those employed. So again, be responsible for mistakes, own the mistakes. Never ever feel that a mistake can't be corrected. Above all, take care that invoices do not exceed the estimates. That's the restoration. And so that brings us to Collegium, and I'm so excited to be part of this, and next is as well, being a shareholder in Collegium, that really novel times need novel processes, and novel processes employ novel technology. So this is what keeps me going, is keeping this moved on. Reimagining the process of making buildings, tackling the archaic and the arcane in many ways. And buildings need to be environmentally, socially, and financially sustainable. You know, yeah, there's so much talk about carbon capture and CO2. It was interesting, a stat I found just recently, Mount Etna spewed more carbon dioxide into the air than humans have done in the last 10,000 years. In an hour, more CO2 in the atmosphere than ever before. So I think we need to have something that really thinks about sustainability on many levels. So onwards and upwards. I want to leave this parting thought. I'm not done yet. It's much to do, but can't be done alone. And that's why I think it's great that we can do this together. I know we'll never accomplish it all overnight. I do believe that we can make a difference here and next. And that's what 50 years has been building on. At the end of the day, it's about doing good for all humankind. And I think that's so important in this day and age, that to make all buildings that are less costly, take less time, and above all, they're a joy to live, work, heal, and learn in for everyone. So some of you are going to have to take up that charge. Like I said, there's not a lifetime long enough. But with that, thank you. Yeah, it's been amazing to be part of something that you can leave. Like music endures, but architecture is just so grounded and so important that we get to leave a little bit of us behind at every step. And I think that the future is exceptional. I think the opportunity that's going to come now is going to be beyond imagination, and what we can do at the collegium level. The work Scott's doing on model-based project delivery and Power BI that shocks everybody when they see it. That's our future. That's where we can be. So thank you for sharing this 50 years. As I say, I didn't want to make it too much about me. So thank you for being here with me today.